In the mountains of Macedonia, in the late summer of 1944, a railway bridge that had carried German troop trains for 3 years came apart in a single concussion before first light. The charges had been laid in the dark by men who could ask a shepherd on the slope above for water and be answered without a second glance, because they spoke the language of that valley as if they had been raised in it. The span dropped into the gorge. The trains behind it stopped, and in the reports that moved up the chain afterward, something stranger than the demolition began to surface. The officers caught off guard were not only the enemies. Allied officers, men on the same side as the demolition team, were startled to read of the raid at all, because they had not known that American soldiers were operating in the Greek interior. That is the first thing the record forces you to sit with. This was a unit so completely hidden that the side it served could be surprised by its own work. The men who brought down that bridge wore the uniform of the United States Army. Most of them had been born in American cities, or had walked off Greek merchant ships tied up in American harbors. They had volunteered for a mission their own government would not admit had happened for the next 50 years. And the officer who had built them, the man whose own life explained why the unit existed at all, was by that summer thousands of miles away, fighting a separate war in the Pacific. With no hand in the liberation of the country, his battalion had been raised to free. His name was Peter Clainos, and he had been born in Sparta. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. Clainos came into the world in 1907, in the old Spartan town in the southern Peloponnese, and he was brought across the Atlantic in 1912, a small boy traveling with his father and one of his sisters. The family settled in Manchester, New Hampshire. What happened to the boy after that was the kind of climb the country liked to tell stories about, except that this one was true, and the documents confirm it. He went to West Point. He graduated in 1933, the first man born in Greece ever to come through the United States Military Academy and take a commission. Before the Army, he had helped found a Greek-American fraternal order, the Sons of Pericles, so the question of who he was and where he came from had never been hidden in his life. It was stamped into it. By 1943, the Army had reasons of its own to put that fact to use. The reasons began with a man named William Donovan. Donovan had won the Medal of Honor in the First War and made a fortune as a Wall Street lawyer between the wars. And in 1942, President Roosevelt placed him at the head of a new organization called the Office of Strategic Services, the agency that would one day be remembered as the seed of the Central Intelligence Agency. Donovan had spent time in Britain and the Mediterranean studying how the Axis was being fought, and he'd come back convinced that conventional armies alone would not be enough. He wanted small teams of skilled men dropped behind the German lines to gather intelligence, wreck supply routes, and arm and train the local resistance. And he had noticed something about the country he was recruiting from. America was full of the sons of immigrants, men who carried inside them the languages and the customs and the family memory of the very places the war was being fought. Donovan meant to send them home with weapons. The shape this took inside the OSS was a set of units called operational groups, and they were organized along the lines of blood and language. There were 6 of them in all, raised from Americans of French, Greek, German, Italian, Norwegian, and Yugoslavian descent, each meant to be set down in the country whose tongue its men already spoke. In the Mediterranean, they were gathered under a single parent formation, the 2671st Special Reconnaissance Battalion, and they were trained to a standard borrowed in large part from the British, from the Special Operations Executive and the Commando schools that had been running since the early war. They were taught demolition and weapons and the harder, slower craft of living unseen among a population and turning scattered guerrillas into something that could be aimed. Decades later, they would be recognized as the direct ancestors of the country's modern special forces. In 1943, they had no name the public knew, and that was the entire idea. Out of that concept came the 122nd Infantry Battalion. Roosevelt established it by executive order at the start of 1943 at the request of the Greek government, then living in exile, and the number it was given was not an accident. It was set at 122 to mark the 122 years that had passed since Greece rose against 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. The battalion gathered Greek Americans and, alongside them, Greek merchant seamen whose ships had been caught in American ports when the war closed the sea lanes. A good many of these men were not yet citizens of the country they were now volunteering to serve. The recruiting reached into the Greek-American world through its own institutions, with an OSS officer named Harry Lagodakis and the head of the largest Greek-American fraternal society, George Vornas, drawing volunteers out of the community. By one account that came down from the veterans, the men carried an unlikely codebook into the field, using the constitution of that fraternal order as the basis of a cipher for their wireless traffic, a private language inside a private language. They trained for 7 hard months at Camp Carson in Colorado, and the officer who ran them through it was Major Peter Clainos. The men who left accounts of him remembered a demanding commander, a regular soldier who drove them without sentiment, and who told them plainly that he would not have them shame the Greek people by being anything less than excellent. The homeland was not a soft thing in his mouth. It was a standard, and he held them to it through the dust and the marches until, by August of 1943, the battalion was hard and finished and ready for a war it had not yet been told the shape of. Then the OSS arrived, though the men did not yet know its name. Officers explained that they were looking for volunteers for a mission that was secret, that was dangerous beyond the ordinary measure of combat, and from which the casualty rate was expected to be severe. According to Clainos himself, every man in the battalion stepped forward. The OSS had come asking for 15. After they had looked the battalion over, they raised the number to 200. Those 200 were sent east to Maryland to be remade as commandos. And here the war took its commander away from his men by the dry mechanics of rank. Clainos was a major, and his rank was too senior to lead a unit as small as the one being assembled. He was transferred out. Command of the Greek operational group passed to a lieutenant from Lexington, Kentucky, named Robert Houlihan, a man whose own name carried no Greek in it at all. The battalion that had been built around the homeland was broken up, its men scattered into the new groups, and the officer born in Sparta was sent in another direction entirely. What the volunteers were walking into had already been spelled out by the enemy. On the 18th of October, 1942, Hitler had put his name to the order the German command would enforce as the Commando order, a directive that captured commandos, in uniform or out of it, armed or unarmed, in battle or in flight, were to be slaughtered to the last man. It was rumored among the men that the German command had set a price on a captured commando equal to his own weight in gold. The volunteers knew this. They knew that fewer than 1 in 10 of them was expected to come home. They went anyway, and the reason most of them gave was simple enough. They were soldiers of the United States, and the ground they were being sent to wreck and bleed for was the ground their parents had come from. One of them, looking back across his whole life, put it as plainly as it can be put. They had, he said, the best of both worlds, men of the American army who would also help to free the country that had made their mothers and fathers. The order had been Hitler's answer to a string of Allied commando raids along the coasts of occupied Europe, and what made it notorious on both sides was its reach. It did not matter whether a captured man wore a proper uniform, carried his weapon in the open, or had plainly given himself up. The directive swept all of that aside and required that he be killed regardless, stripping the commando of every protection a captured soldier was owed under the laws of war. German field commanders were bound by it, and in more than one theater it was carried out to the letter. The insertion of the 8 groups ran through the first months of 1944 and on into the autumn. Officers went in first by parachute to make contact with the British military mission already in the mountains and with the Greek guerrilla bands, the Andartes, in their hideouts. Then the groups followed, some dropped by parachute, and some put ashore from the sea, all of them moving under cover of darkness, and they fanned out across the whole length of the country. One group worked in Epirus in the northwest. Others took Rumeli in the center, Thessaly, the slopes of Olympus, the high country around Mount Picon, the Peloponnese in the south, and Macedonia in the north. They linked up with the fighters of the National Liberation Front and its army, the movement the Greeks called EM and ELAS, the largest of the resistance organizations, living rough alongside men who had been fighting the occupier for years and who knew every track and cave and friendly farmhouse in their districts. The thing they had all come to attack was movement. The German occupation of Greece rested on roughly 150,000 troops, and by the middle of 1944 the war had turned against the Reich everywhere, which meant those men and their guns and their stores would soon have to be pulled north and out of the country, up through the Balkans, toward a shrinking front. A retreating army is at its most fragile on the move, strung out along a few roads and a few rail lines with everything it owns rolling through a handful of bridges and passes. Every part of that, the track, the spans, the road convoys, the timetables, became the target. The groups blew bridges and tore up rail and ambush columns, and they also went after a quieter cargo. Through Greece by rail moved Strategic or Chrome among it, headed from Turkey to the factories of Germany, and the OSS struck at that traffic as well, working from intelligence passed by the American naval attaché in Ankara. None of this was the work of a single grand stroke. It was patient, repeated demolition, the cutting of a long enemy artery a piece at a time, in country where a single drop bridge could strand a column for days. What this asked of the men was simple to state and hard to live. They worked in small parties, far from any friendly line, carrying what they needed through high country where the weather could turn in an hour, and a single wrong track could walk a man into a German patrol. There was no reinforcement to call if a raid went wrong, because there was none to send. Resupply came by air when it came at all, dropped to them in the dark. Their safety lay in speed, in concealment, and in the goodwill of the villages around them, and almost nowhere else. The training they had been given in Maryland and by the British had been shaped for exactly this. The work of the small armed party living and fighting on its own behind an enemy front, and the mountains of Greece were where it was finally spent. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The Macedonia bridge that opens this account belonged to one of these men, a corporal from California named Andrew Mausalimas, who had been one of the 200 volunteers and who served in the group working the northern mountains. He lived a long life and, decades on, set down what he had done, so we have his account in his own hand. His group ran ambushes and brought down rail lines, and the bridge his team destroyed had been carrying Axis troop trains until the morning it stopped doing so. He called the raid a complete surprise, and he meant it in two directions at once. It surprised the Germans, who lost the bridge and the trains behind it. It also surprised the Allied command, because the officers running the larger war had not been told that American commandos were loose in the Greek mountains blowing their targets out from under them. The work was that closely held. Mausalimas came out of it having lost much of his hearing to the blasts he had set off too close to his own ears, and having taken on a secret he would carry for the rest of the century. What the 8 groups accomplished is preserved as a tally in the unit's records, and the numbers are worth stating because the men paid for every one of them. Across the campaign, the groups carried out 76 operations. By the count kept afterward, more than 2,000 of the enemy were killed, wounded, or taken. The groups destroyed 15 bridges and 11 locomotives, broke up 32 rail cars and 63 military vehicles, knocked out 6 garrisons, and tore up more than 9,000 meters of railway. Against that, the Greek battalion and the operational groups drawn from it lost 3 men killed in action and had 23 wounded. The disproportion is the point. These are not soldiers throwing themselves at fixed positions. They were men who appeared, struck, and were gone before the response could form, and who knew the ground and the people well enough to vanish into both. For the work, the unit came home with a Presidential Unit Citation and what the records describe as an Army record for the number of individual Bronze Star medals awarded to a single outfit, decorations earned, and then, like everything else about them, filed away out of sight. The deepest figure in the whole account is the one that records what did not happen. Not one member of the group was ever betrayed to the Germans. Not one was captured. The commando order was never carried out against them, and the gold that had been promised for a commando's body was never claimed. These were uniformed soldiers who, if taken, would not have been treated as prisoners of war at all, but stood against a wall and shot, and they operated for months inside a country crawling with the occupier and his informers. No Greek villager ever gave them up, not for the reward, and not under the pressure the occupier could bring to bear on a mountain hamlet. That is the thing the men themselves pointed to when they were finally allowed to speak. Their survival had not been only a matter of their own skill. It had rested on the silence of an entire population that had every material reason to talk and did not. The instrument Donovan had imagined turned out to work for a reason he had only half foreseen. Sending men who were of the country meant sending men the country would shelter. Their commander had no share in any of it. While his battalion was opening the German rail lines in the mountains of his birth, Peter Clainos was on the far side of the world. He had gone to the Pacific, where he commanded a battalion of the 32nd Infantry in the 81st Infantry Division, the outfit that fought that autumn through the Palau Islands. And there, in that same year, 1944, he won the Silver Star for gallantry in action against the Japanese. The Army had built a unit around the fact that he was a Greek who had become an American soldier, and that it had spent that soldier somewhere else, against a different enemy, for reasons that had nothing to do with the symmetry of his story. The men he had drilled at Camp Carson went into Greece without him. He fought his war on the coral of the Pacific and never set foot on the ground his battalion was created to free. The division he fought with, the 81st, took the wildcat as its emblem, and the islands it was thrown against that autumn were among the worst ground in the whole Pacific War, ridges of rock and cave, where Japanese soldiers fought from positions that had to be cleared one at a time. It was the opposite, in almost every particular, of the war his battalion fought in Greece. There was no friendly population to shelter him, and no language he shared with anyone across the line. The Silver Star he was given there was for gallantry against an enemy who meant to sell every yard at the highest price he could exact. The campaign these men fought belonged to a larger Allied effort to make the German withdrawal from Greece as costly as possible, an effort the British Special Operations Executive had framed under the name Operation Noah's Ark, and which fell in practice mostly to the British missions and the Greek guerrillas. The Americans were one part of it, and a small one by head count. But what the operational groups proved was not about scale. It was about a kind of soldier the war had not used at this depth before, the citizen who carried a second country inside him and could be put down inside it as if he had never left. Donovan had argued that the rich mix of America could give the country fighters no other army could field. The men in the Greek mountains were the argument made flesh, and the proof of it was that they walked among a hunted, occupied people as one of their own. The politics behind that withdrawal were stranger and colder than the men setting the charges could have known. London's stake in Greece was not only military. The British government meant to see the pre-war order restored and the king brought back, and it watched the strength of the resistance, most of it gathered under the communist-led EM and LAS, with open unease. There were moments when British calculation ran in a direction the guerrillas in the hills would have found unthinkable, a quiet preference that the German garrison hold together and surrender in good order rather than collapse and leave the country to the very resistance the Allies had spent 2 years arming. The German pullout, when it came, at times went more smoothly than the commanders in Berlin had feared. The men in the mountains were one small part of something far larger and more dangerous than the war they could see from a demolition site, and that danger would surface the moment the occupier was gone. And then the silence closed over them. The records of the ethnic operational groups, the Greek among them, were sealed, and they stayed sealed for decades, locked away by the agency the OSS had become. The war record of the Greek group would later be called one of the best-kept secrets of the entire war, and the description was close to literal. The operational files were not opened until the late 1980s, and the personnel records of the OSS itself were held back until 2008. For something close to 50 years, the men carried what they had done as a thing they could not talk about, not to neighbors, not to friends, in some cases barely to family. They came home and built ordinary lives over the top of it. Mausalimas went back to Oakland and ran a bar, the King's X on Piedmont Avenue, a place that would later be remembered for an entirely different reason, as one of the rooms where the game called fantasy football was first invented. The men who had blown the bridges of Macedonia sold drinks and ran shops and raised children, and the country they had served did not know what it owed them, because it had ordered them not to say. The liberation they had helped win did not give Greece peace. Within weeks of the German departure, the capital came apart. In December of 1944, fighting broke out in Athens between the resistance the Americans had armed and the British-backed forces of the returning government, and the country slid from occupation into a civil war that would grind on until 1949. The very movement the operational groups had fought beside in the mountains, the fighters of EM and ELAS, would be on the losing side of that war, and many of the villages that had sheltered the Americans would pay for the next years in a way the occupation had only begun. The men of the operational groups had freed the land. They had not been able to free it from what came after. That, too, is part of the honest account, and the record does not let it be tidied away. Mausalimas was among those who finally set the story down. He published his account in 2004, 6 decades after the events, once the files had begun to open and a man could put in print what he had done in the mountains without breaking the secrecy that had held him most of his life. The work had stayed buried so long that telling it had become its own kind of task, a matter of getting it onto the record at last, while a few of the men who had lived it were still alive to do the telling. Recognition, when it finally came late, and came from both of the countries these men had answered to. On the 26th of May, 2005, a bronze statue of a single alert soldier, the work of the California sculptor Andrew Safas, was unveiled in a park of the Hellenic Army in Athens. On its base were cut the names of 224 men, and the inscription, in English and in Greek, honored the volunteers, the Greek Americans and Greek immigrants and Americans of Company C of the 26th 71st Special Reconnaissance Battalion, who had fought in 1944 for the liberation of Greece, the occupied land of their forebears. Some of the old men were there to see it, Mausalimas among them, standing beside the sculptor with a few of his comrades who were still living. 13 years after that, in March of 2018, the surviving veterans of the OSS were called to the Capitol in Washington and given the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor the Congress can bestow. Mausalimas received his there. He died in 2020, in his 96th year, one of the last of the men who had gone into the mountains. Peter Clainos did not live to see the statue in Athens. He had stayed in the army through the war's end and beyond it, was decorated again with the Legion of Merit, and retired as a colonel in 1963. He died in 1994 and was buried in the cemetery at West Point, the academy that had made him the first Greek-born officer to wear an American commission. The unit he forged is named on a monument in the country of his birth, in a city he reached only by the long road of memory, and his own name is not among the 224 on that base, because by the summer his men crossed into Greece, he had already been sent away to fight elsewhere. He built the instrument and never held it in the place it was made for. That is its own kind of soldier's fate, to make the thing and then be ordered away before it is used, and the record carries it without comment, the way it carries so much else. Go back, then, to the bridge in the Macedonian dark, and to the thing that startled the officers who read of it. American soldiers were at work in the Greek mountains, and almost no one on their own side knew. They had been raised for it by a Spartan-born colonel who would spend the war an ocean away. They survived because the country of their fathers sheltered them and never sold them, even with German gold on the table. And they kept the secret of it so well, for so long, that the men they had killed and the bridges they had dropped and the comrades they had buried stayed sealed in a file until most of them were old men in quiet towns. What the country eventually realized about these men, it realized 50 years late. The men themselves had known all along exactly who they were and what they had done, and exactly whose ground they had bled into. They simply had not been allowed to say it. The record can say it now. Their names are cut in stone in Athens, 224 of them, and they deserve to be read. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.